I never thought painting my front door would make me a target. But then again, I also didn't think a suburban HOA could act like a petty dictatorship either. It started with a navy blue paint I picked out after seeing something similar on a trip to Charleston. It wasn't loud or garish, just ... classic. I figured it would add a little charm to my otherwise bland beige home in Sunset Valley, the day after I painted it. I got a letter taped to my doorknob, mailed, not handed over. Just taped like some passive-aggressive calling card. Your door color is in violation of HOA community guidelines. Approved colors are listed in Section 3, Subsection B, Paragraph 6. No signature, no name. Just a typed-up page with the HOA logo. At first, I laughed. I really did. I thought surely this is a misunderstanding, so I went to the next. HOA meeting, navy blue door and all, expecting a quick chat and maybe a laugh about overzealous volunteers. Instead, I met Deborah Collins. Deborah was the HOA president. And if you're imagining a woman in her early 50s with a tight bun, designer glasses, and a tone that could curdle milk, you're exactly right. She stood at the head of the community center's fold-out table setup, like a general addressing her troops. When I raised my hand to discuss the letter, she didn't even let me finish my sentence before cutting me off. The color navy is not on the approved palette, she said with the kind of finality reserved for court verdicts. I didn't know there was a palette, I replied, trying to keep it light. It was in your welcome packet, she said, without blinking. Page 47. I moved here 8 years ago, and you've had ample time to familiarize yourself. That was the beginning of what would become a bizarre, escalating, and at times deeply infuriating war over one man's front door. And what it means when a handful of power-hungry neighbors are given unchecked authority over others? Left that meeting stunned, not just by the absurdity of it all, but by how quickly the room had turned against me. It was like high school politics dressed up in khakis and homeowner regulations. The other board members nodded solemnly, and someone even took notes as Deborah issued a formal warning. I went home and reread the bylaws. Yes, buried on page 47 was indeed a list of approved color staupe. White, dusty rose. What even is dusty rose? Olive sand and beige. A rainbow of repression. I considered repainting the door. I really did. I thought, why fight? It's just a door. But then I thought about the letter. About Deborah's smug face. About the way the other residents looked at me like I was some troublemaker for wanting a color that didn't look like it had been pre-chewed. So I left it. And that's when things got weird. Within a week, I received 2 more notices. One for unauthorized plant selection, apparently. The daisies I planted didn't meet aesthetic harmony requirements. And another for a misaligned trash receptacle, because my bin was 6 inches outside of the approved placement zone on collection day. Each notice came with a fine $. $25 for the flowers, $40 for the trash can. I paid neither. That's when Darren showed up. Darren Hughes was the self-appointed HOA compliance officer. It's not an actual job. Mind you, just a title he gave himself after Deborah allegedly asked him to help keep an eye on things. Darren was the kind of man who wore mirrored sunglasses at dusk and called his dog Lieutenant. He showed up at my house with a clipboard and a walkie-talkie, looking like he was auditioning for a part-time mall cop job. I'm here to perform an exterior audit, without introducing himself. An audit? For compliance? With what? He clicked his pen like it made him more official. Relations. I'm not letting you on my property, I said. He looked genuinely offended. I have HOA authority. You have a clipboard and a lot of confidence. That's not the same thing. He walked away, muttering something into his walkie-talkie, like he was calling for backup. I have expected a toy drone to circle my roof, too. Days later, I got a notice for non-cooperation during an inspection. $75 fine. This went on for weeks. Each time I didn't pay, another fee was added. Deborah began sending strongly worded letters, then came threats of liens on my property. Spoke with a lawyer who laughed when he read the documents. They can't actually do most of this, he said. They're bluffing. They'd have to take you to court, and no judge is going to side with them over flowers and a blue door. I considered legal action but decided instead to fight fire. With sunlight, I began attending every HOA meeting. I brought copies of their own bylaws. I pointed out inconsistencies. I took notes. I asked hard questions about where our dues were going, why the community park still had broken sprinklers after 2 years, why the HOA newsletter had a budget bigger than the landscaping crew. Deborah did not like that. One night after I'd questioned a $3,200 consulting fee paid to Deborah's cousin, I found a notice on my door stating that my mailbox was non-compliant due to angular discrepancies. Angular discrepancies. I took a level to it. It's perfectly straight. I documented everything. Photos, videos, receipts. I started a private Facebook group for other residents. Slowly stories came out. One neighbor was fined for having excessive wind chimes. Another was told her garden gnome invited undesirable wildlife. A family down the street was cited for having a basketball hoop that was visible from the road. It wasn't just me. Deborah and her cronies were running the HOA like a tiny kingdom, rewarding loyalty, punishing dissent, and hiding behind bylaws that most people never read. So I dug deeper. I requested financial records. At first I was ignored. Then I was told they were under audit. I cited state law requiring HOAs to provide that information to residents upon request. They stalled. I showed up at the office in person. They called security. The security guard was Darren. I laughed so hard I had to sit down. Eventually they relented. I got a USB drive with spreadsheets and scanned receipts. Spent 3 nights going through everything. There were thousands in consulting fees to family members, payments for community improvements that never happened, reimbursements for business meals at 5-star restaurants. I compiled a report, and I sent it to every resident. Then I painted my door a brighter shade of navy. That's when the real war began. The day after I mailed out the financial report, my mailbox was smashed in with a baseball bat. I replaced it and installed a security camera. 2 nights later, someone spray-painted rule breaker across my garage door. That's when I stopped thinking of this as a neighborhood dispute and started treating it like an operation. I set up surveillance. I filed a police report, began documenting not just the actions against me, but every interaction, every letter, every notice. Then came the big one, a notice informing me that the HOA had filed a lien against my property for unpaid fines totaling over $1,400. I knew it wouldn't hold up in court, but they were betting I wouldn't want the hassle. They were wrong. I filed a formal dispute. I requested a hearing. I brought a lawyer. The hearing lasted 10 minutes before Deborah adjourned it, citing procedural confusion. More residents started coming to me with their own stories. Single mother fined for letting her kids draw with sidewalk chalk. An elderly couple cited for a non-regulation bird feeder. One man fluent in 6 languages and retired from the State Department was fined $54 having foreign signage. Because his welcome mat said Benvenidos. I compiled everything. I made a dossier. I began referring to it as the HOA files. That's when Darren crossed the line. He showed up at my house one evening while I was working in the garage. He didn't knock. He didn't call out. Just walked into my garage like he owned the place. Wearing a knockoff security uniform, complete with a plastic badge and a utility belt. "Sir," he said, in the tone of someone trying very hard to sound like a cop, "you are in violation of multiple HOA ordinances. I need to inspect the premises." I looked up from my workbench and stared at him. "You need to leave. Have authority under section." "No," I said. "You don't. Get off my hat." "Property." He stepped closer and rested his hand on what appeared to be a holstered weapon. That's when I stood up. "What is that?" I asked. "Non-lethal deterrent," he replied. "It's a fake gun," I said. "You brought a toy into my garage and are now pretending to be law enforcement. That's impersonation." He shifted uncomfortably. "You need to leave," I said. "Again, now." He hesitated, then turned and walked out. As he walked back to his car, I called after him. "I really hope it doesn't come to that, Darren, for your sake." The fake gun incident was a game changer that transformed this whole situation from annoying suburban comedy into something that could have serious legal consequences for everyone involved. That evening, I sat at my computer and began doing the kind of research I should have done months ago. Clearly, the HOA played by no civilized rules. I needed to know who these people really were, what authority they actually had, and most importantly, what they were trying to hide behind all this ridiculous theater that was starting to look more like organized crime than community management. My first discovery was that Darren Hughes had no law enforcement background whatsoever, which came as absolutely no surprise given his performance with the replica pistol and his general approach to security work. He sold car parts. That's it. His transformation from toy-wielding audio inspector to wannabe security officer was starting to make sense in the worst possible way, watching a crisis unfold with props and poor judgment. But it was what I discovered about the HOA finances. That really opened my eyes to what was happening in Sunset Valley and why. Deborah Collins was so determined to maintain control over her little kingdom. I spent hours going through every receipt, every invoice, and every expenditure report I could get my hands on. And the pattern that emerged was absolutely infuriating in its brazen audacity. Over the past months, Deborah approved thousands in fake expenses from plastic flowers to replica pistols. The numbers didn't add up at all, unless someone was either incredibly bad at math or incredibly good at theft. I made copies of everything and started building a file that would make any investigator proud, because someone needed to document this insanity before it escalated into something that actually got someone hurt. 3 days after the gun incident, I got an unexpected visitor that would prove to be the final piece of the puzzle. I needed to understand what was really happening in Sunset Valley. An elderly neighbor from across the street knocked on my door. She was looking nervous, but determined to share something important that she'd been keeping to herself for too long. Her hands trembled as she handed me a small digital camera. This wasn't just neighborly help, this was bravery. She'd been living in Sunset Valley for over 10 years, long before Deborah Collins had taken over the HOA and transformed it from a normal community organization into whatever this thing was. "I saw what happened in your garage the other day," she said quietly, glancing around like she was afraid of being overheard by the HOA's secret police. That young man with the gun eye recorded the whole thing from my kitchen window. The video was crystal clear, showing Darren pointing his replica weapon at me while wearing his fake security uniform. But that wasn't all she had to share, because apparently I wasn't the first person to experience the unique hospitality of the Sunset Valley HOA enforcement team. This neighbor had been documenting Deborah's behavior for months. Ever since several longtime residents had been forced to move away after receiving, it's possible to pay fines for violations that seem to be made up on the spot. She's driven out for families in the past year. Ouch! The kind of quiet anger that comes from watching injustice happen over and over without being able to stop it. Good people who'd lived here for decades, forced to sell their homes because they couldn't afford the constant fines and legal harassment. This wasn't about my door anymore. This was about every family she'd forced out, every quiet defeat I never saw. But the most damning evidence she provided was an audio recording she'd made during a closed HOA meeting, where Deborah thought only her supporters were present, and she could speak freely about her real plans for the community. The recording was crystal clear, and Deborah's voice was unmistakable as she discussed her strategy for removing undesirable elements from the community and using the violation system to generate additional revenue streams for HOA operations. Buy expensive equipment with community funds, then reported as community improvements. Deborah's voice said on the recording with the casual tone of someone discussing the weather, "As long as they shut up and pay, no one checks receipts." There it was, plain as day and recorded for posterity. Deborah Collins admitting that she was deliberately overcharging the HOA for purchases and pocketing the difference, while also admitting that the violation system was designed not to maintain community standards, but to generate money through systematic harassment. Armed with this evidence, I knew exactly what I had to do, and it wasn't going to involve any more polite conversations about door colors or plastic flowers. This wasn't just about my personal convenience anymore. This was about justice for every resident who'd been bullied, cheated, and driven away by Deborah's corrupt little empire. I began planning a community meeting where every resident would see exactly what their HOA president had been doing with their money and their trust. Because sometimes the only way to stop a bully is to drag their behavior into the light where everyone can see it for what it really is. The woman who'd brought me evidence had shown more courage in one afternoon than Deborah had shown in her entire tenure as HOA president. And I wasn't going to let that bravery go to waste. The community meeting I'd organized was scheduled for 7 o'clock on a Thursday evening at the Sunset Valley Community Center. I'd spent the previous week quietly reaching out to every household in the neighborhood with the kind of methodical approach that my old training had taught me was essential for any successful operation. I personally invited them to attend what I described as an important discussion about HOA financial transparency and community safety. Being careful not to make any accusations or reveal my specific evidence beforehand, because sometimes the element of surprise is the most powerful weapon you have. By 6:30, 23 families had shown up, which represented almost every household in our small community and suggested that a lot of people had been waiting for someone to finally address the elephant in the room. Or in this case, the corrupt HOA president in the room. Deborah arrived fashionably late, sweeping into the community center like she was making a grand entrance. She was dressed in an expensive navy blue business suit and carried herself with the confidence of someone who expected to control the proceedings. Through sheer force of personality, Naroon followed behind her like a loyal puppy, still wearing parts of his fake security uniform, but looking distinctly uncomfortable about being in a room full of neighbors who might ask awkward questions about his qualifications and equipment. Well, Deborah announced as she took a seat in the front row. I see Mr. West has decided to call his own little meeting. How democratic of him. The sarcasm in her voice was thick enough to cut with a knife. But I noticed that several other residents exchanged glances that suggested they were getting tired of her attitude and ready to hear what someone else had to say for a change. I stood up at the front of the room and looked around at the faces of my neighbors, seeing good people who'd been paying their HOA fees and following the rules, trusting that their money was being used responsibly and their community was being managed fairly by people who actually cared about something other than their own power and profit. They deserved to know the truth about what had been happening right under their noses, while they'd been going about their daily lives assuming that the people they'd elected to manage their community actually had their best interests at heart. Thank you all for coming tonight. I began, keeping my voice calm and professional, because getting emotional would just give Deborah ammunition to use against me. I called this meeting because I've discovered some information about our HOA finances and enforcement practices that I believe every resident has a right to know. I pulled out a manila folder containing copies of all the financial documents I'd gathered, along with the audio and video evidence that would tell the real story of what had been happening in Sunset Valley. Started with the flower arrangements holding up identical plastic bouquets and explaining that the HOA had paid $150 each for flowers that cost $15 at the discount store, which was either the worst shopping in history or deliberate fraud designed to enrich someone at the community's expense. Then I showed them Darren's security equipment totaling $654 items that appeared to consist mainly of a replica pistol and a costume shop uniform that had no legal authority whatsoever. With each revelation, I watched the faces in the room change from confused to concerned to genuinely angry, as people realized that their trust had been violated and their money had been stolen by people they trusted to manage their community responsibly. But wait, I continued, because sometimes humor is the best way to deal with tragedy. There's more. I pulled out the audio recording device and set it on the table in front of me like a prosecutor presenting the key evidence in a murder trial. When Deborah's voice filled the room, admitting that she was deliberately overcharging for community purchases and using the violation system to generate revenue through systematic harassment, the air snapped. Betrayal has a sound. People started whispering angrily to each other, and I could see several residents taking notes and pulling out their phones to record what was happening, because they wanted their own evidence of this moment when the truth finally came to light. This recording was made illegally, Deborah protested, jumping to her feet. But her protests were drowned out by questions from increasingly angry residents who wanted to know where their money had gone and why they'd been paying inflated fines for made-up violations. And it was clear that her usual intimidation tactics weren't going to work on a room full of people who'd finally seen behind the curtain. That's when I decided it was time to play my final card. The one that would explain why I'd been able to conduct this investigation so thoroughly, and why Deborah's attempts at intimidation had failed so spectacularly. "There's one more thing you all should know," I said, raising my voice too. "Quiet the room, because what I was about to say would change how everyone viewed this situation. 3 days ago, Mr. Hughes here pointed what appeared to be a firearm at me in my own garage, claiming to have authority from this HOA to detain residents for violations. The room went completely silent as I let that sink in, because threatening people with weapons, even fake ones, crosses a line that most civilized people understand shouldn't be crossed. I have video evidence of this incident." I added, "But more importantly, I want you to understand exactly who you're dealing with." I paused for a moment, looking directly at Deborah Collins with the kind of steady gaze that I'd learned could communicate more than words ever could. "My name is Colby West. I served 6 years in the United States Navy as a CLL, with multiple deployments in combat zones where I faced real weapons from real enemies, fighting for real causes that actually mattered. The revelation of my military background changed the entire dynamic in the room. And suddenly, my calm demeanor and systematic approach to gathering evidence made perfect sense to everyone present. These weren't the actions of an angry resident making wild accusations. This was someone with real training and experience who'd conducted a professional investigation and found serious wrongdoing that needed to be addressed. I know the difference between actual authority and people playing dress up with plastic badges," I said. "I also know the difference between legitimate community management and organized fraud designed to enrich the people in charge at everyone else's expense." Deborah Collins's face had gone completely white during my revelation, and for the first time since I'd met her, she looked genuinely frightened, which was probably the most appropriate response she could have had. Given the circumstances, I didn't want applause. I wanted accountability for people to stop being afraid of clipboards and cheap uniforms. As I watched my neighbors process what I'd just told them, I could see something changing in their faces. They didn't just believe me, they remembered what it was like to trust each other. The community council president, a retired teacher who'd been watching this whole drama unfold with growing concern, stood up and addressed the room with the kind of authority that comes from decades of managing difficult situations. "I think it's clear that we need to take immediate action," she said in a voice that brooked no argument. "We need to vote on whether Deborah Collins should continue as HOA president. And we need to contact the proper authorities about the financial irregularities that Mr. West has documented." The motion was seconded immediately, and within minutes we had an impromptu election that would determine the future of Sunset Valley, and whether justice would finally be served to people who'd been abusing their power for far too long. Vote wasn't even close, which shouldn't have surprised anyone who'd been paying attention to the evidence. But it was still satisfying to see democracy in action, when it actually works the way it's supposed to. 23 ballots cast, 23 votes to remove Deborah Collins from her position as HOA president, with not a single resident voting. To keep her in office, not even Darren, who'd apparently decided that his loyalty only extended as far as his fake paycheck and costume shop uniform. The moment the community council president announced the results, you could feel the collective relief in the room, like a physical presence, as if everyone had been holding their breath for months and could finally exhale. People started applauding, not just for the vote, but for finally being free from months or years of harassment, intimidation, financial manipulation by people who'd turned community management into a personal profit center and power trip. Deborah sat in stunned silence for several minutes, staring at the ballot box like she couldn't believe that her carefully constructed empire had crumbled so quickly and completely. Finally, she gathered her belongings and walked toward the exit without saying a word. Her expensive suit unable to disguise the fact that she looked like someone who just realized that actions have consequences and bills eventually come due. Reign of Terror was over, and everyone in the room knew it. But the community wasn't finished yet, because removing a corrupt leader is only the first step in fixing a broken system. And these people had learned the hard way that eternal vigilance is the price of keeping your homeowners association from turning into a criminal enterprise. The council president called for additional votes to establish a new 5-person HOA board with rotating leadership and complete financial transparency, eliminate all of Deborah's ridiculous rules, and require Deborah to reimburse the community fund for all improperly spent money within 30 days. Darren slipped out during the voting, but not before publicly apologizing for his role in Deborah's schemes. Several residents asked whether we should report his threats to the police, but I suggested that his public humiliation was probably punishment enough for someone who'd been manipulated almost as much as the rest of us. 3 weeks after the community meeting, I was standing in my driveway with a can of navy blue paint, preparing to restore my front door to its original color and complete the circle that had started this whole adventure in suburban justice. The new HOA board had unanimously voted to eliminate all color restrictions for front doors, along with most of Deborah's other aesthetic rules that had turned the simple act of homeownership into a constant battle against arbitrary enforcement and made-up violations. As I opened the paint can and stirred the familiar navy blue that had triggered this entire sequence of events, I couldn't help but smile at how far we'd all come. Several neighbors stopped by to watch the painting process, joking that my door was probably the most famous front door in Arizona. After everything that had happened, the transformation of Sunset Valley had been remarkable to witness, like watching a community emerge from a long winter into the warm sunshine of democracy and common sense. Without Deborah's constant harassment and made-up violations, the neighborhood had become a genuinely pleasant place to live, where people were friendlier, more relaxed, and actually seemed to enjoy living in their community, instead of walking around in constant fear of citations and fines. The new HOA board published monthly financial reports and established a simple, democratic process for making decisions about community improvements that actually improve the community rather than enriching the people in charge. It was everything a homeowners association should be: transparent, accountable, focused on actually serving the residents. As I applied the final coat of navy blue paint to my door, I reflected on everything that had happened over the past few months and how a simple decision to paint my door a color I liked had led to exposing corruption, dismantling a fraudulent organization, and helping my neighbors reclaim their community from a petty tyrant. When I'd moved to Sunset Valley, all I'd wanted was a quiet place to repair antique clocks and enjoy my retirement in peace. It didn't take combat to feel useful again, just the courage to stand when no one else would. The investigation had been surprisingly satisfying, like solving a puzzle where all the pieces finally clicked into place to reveal a picture that made perfect sense once you could see the whole thing. That evening, I fired up my old jazz collection and set the volume at a comfortable level, loud enough to enjoy, but not so loud as to bother the neighbors. The music filled my garage as I returned to work on a 1947 watch that had been waiting patiently for my attention during all the HOA drama. And for the first time in months, I was able to lose myself completely in the precise, meditative work of cleaning and adjusting tiny gears and springs. The combination of music, meaningful work, and the knowledge that my community was finally free from corruption created the kind of peaceful evening I'd been hoping for when I first moved to Arizona, around 9 o'clock. I heard a car pull into my driveway, and I looked up to see the community council president walking toward my garage, with a small wrapped package in her hands and the kind of smile that suggested good news was coming my way. I hope I'm not disturbing your work, she said, but the new HOA board wanted to give you something as a thank you for everything you did for the community. Inside the package was a beautiful handcrafted wooden sign that read, Colby West, Honorary Community Hero, along with a smaller plaque explaining that it was a gift from the grateful residents of Sunset Valley in recognition of service above and beyond the call of duty. We also voted to make you an honorary member of the HOA board. She continued, with no responsibilities, except to occasionally remind us not to let power go to our heads, because we never want to forget the lessons we learned from this experience. As she drove away, and I hung my new sign next to my freshly painted navy blue door, I thought about how strange life could be sometimes, and how the most important battles are often the ones you never planned to fight. 6 months ago, I'd been an anonymous retiree who just wanted to blend into a quiet neighborhood and work on old clocks without anyone bothering me. Tonight, I was the guy who'd taken down a corrupt HOA president and helped restore democracy to a small Arizona community with neighbors who knew I was a former Navy SEAL, but more importantly, knew I was someone they could count on to stand up for what was right when it mattered. The last thing I did before going inside was to adjust my small security camera so it was no longer recording my driveway because I wouldn't be needing surveillance footage anymore. Deborah Collins had moved away 2 weeks after the community meeting, selling her house quickly and quietly. The fake uniforms and replica weapons had disappeared, replaced by the kind of boring normalcy that makes for a peaceful community, where people can paint their doors whatever color they want and listen to jazz music without fear of arbitrary enforcement. As I turned off my garage lights and headed inside, I looked one more time at my navy blue door gleaming under the porch light. Like a small beacon of victory over bureaucratic nonsense and suburban tyranny. They hadn't known who they were messing with when this all started, but they definitely knew now. And most importantly, my door was exactly the color I wanted it to be. Sometimes, the smallest victories are the most satisfying ones, especially when they come with the knowledge that you've helped make your little corner of the world a better place for everyone who has to live in it.